Let's talk about the difference between what a demo really sounds like and what a final master sounds like. When you hear something and you go, wow, that sounds like a record, or you hear something you've done and you go, I don't know, it just sounds like a demo still. How come I can't make it sound like a final product? There's a couple reasons why that I've come up with through the years of listening and my own work and listening to other people's work. I think one of the big things is about blend consistency. When you've got instruments that stay in perspective with each other. So in a verse, an acoustic guitar player may play quietly. In the chorus, he may play harder. So his volume goes from quiet to loud. And all the other elements have to ebb and flow together dynamically. When they do, it's like a really well-rehearsed dance that they do together. When they don't, then it's just like one guy's popping out, the other guy's getting lost, and it's like a basketball team that doesn't know the play. So that's what makes it sound really professional when everybody is well executing their position, so to speak. If you liken it to a sports team, it's like if everybody knows the play and they're all working together, it makes it so much more of a potent message sonically than if people are in conflict with each other. One guy's trying to be the star, he's trying to do a drum solo while the lead guitar player is trying to show his chops. That doesn't really work. You got to really respect each other's space and give them their place and then work together. So demos momentarily lose this level consistency between sound elements and overall dynamics of the song change. And so it may be very subtle, but you perceive it as not being well executed. If all of a sudden you're going to a chorus and the bass pops out a little more than it did. And it may be very subtle, and it's not even just levels. It's about intensity performance. Naturally, my first go-to in that situation is to compressors, because compressors limit the dynamics, so once you have something controlled on each element, then they can move together a lot easier. Frequency blend is also really important to a final compared to a demo. As we were mentioning before, when masking occurs, when the bass guitar is covering up the kick drum and you can't hear the kick drum because they're in the same frequency range and they're playing on top of each other, there's ways to create that extra sonic space with compressors and gates and give them their own space, and you really want to have everybody in the game playing together rather than one guy taking more space than the other guys. So they all have to remain sonically blended when they change dynamics, which is a real trick because when they get more dynamic, the sonic character of each element changes. So it's kind of a tricky situation, and the way that you can sort of start is with light compression on each element because it keeps it a little more consistent, and then you can really balance it a lot better. In my early days of mixing, I used to not use a lot of compression, and I would use a lot of level changing with computers changing levels of faders, and that's what took me hours and days to program into the computer. And it never really felt right because I was intellectually figuring out, oh, that's a little too loud there, I'll pull it down. Oh, that's a little too quiet there, I'll push it up. And always fighting intellectually the musical performance instead of allowing the musicians to play together well and using compressors to help blend them together in terms of their dynamics. Once I really discovered the beauty of compression, everything became so much easier and everything sounded like final products. People are a little intimidated by compression because sometimes it's easy to overuse it. If you start with very light compression on your sound elements, it just helps make everything a little more consistent so that you can actually blend it better and work with it better. Synthesizers are generally less dynamic, and electric instruments are less dynamic than acoustic instruments. But in general, you can actually do this with synthesizers. So let's say you've got a drum machine playing a drum performance, and you put compression on the kick drum and the snare drum like you would with a real drummer. All of a sudden it starts sounding more like a real drummer, and it sounds better. It just works better and keeps the dynamics more controlled. So the peaks that would pop out are being controlled, and so the drum sort of sits in a certain sonic space and sort of stays there so that you can build the other parts around it. It's almost like building the foundation of a house. So if you're building a building and your foundation is solid and consistent, then you can build a nice structure on top that's going to be solid. But if your foundation is a little wobbly because the drums are getting louder here, getting quieter there, the bass isn't really in perfect synchronization with the drums, then all of a sudden you have this sort of wobbly foundation, and what you build on it is going to sort of teeter a little. And I look at it sort of like that. It's sort of like a building process where your foundational elements are your rhythm elements, and the melody elements are more of the garnishment on top. And you can build a mix in that way. The way you organize your mix in your computer even, start one end with drums, bass, rhythm keyboards, rhythm guitars, melody instruments, vocals, background vocals. If you structure it that way, then you start thinking about it that way. You build the drum kit and make it sound consistent, and then add the percussion so that it works together with the rhythms of the drummer, and then add the bass in so all three elements are working well together. Add other rhythm instruments in. If you have to change the foundational rhythm elements during the tail end of a mix, after you brought the vocals in, you're chasing your tail end. You're kind of like taking a jack and propping up part of the foundation to make it work. The best thing to do is start over, build a foundation again, and then build on top of it. People that push everything up all the time, oh, I don't hear enough vocal, let's push it up. Oh, wait, now I don't hear enough bass, push it up. Oh, I don't hear enough snare drum, push it up. You're going to lose that way because you got to realize that pulling down things also works. Faders go down too, they don't only go up. Most people just keep pushing things up that I need a little more of this, so push it up. Maybe the best thing to do is pull other things down so you create more space. When to mix is a really important concept. Most people find that they go through the process of recording, they work out all of their parts, they overdub all their parts, and then they decide, okay, we're going to mix. All of the pieces are there, now let's put it together. And in the old days, we used to pull all the faders down, and we used to go, okay, now we're going to mix. We're going to start mixing. That was really a bad idea because our rough mixes 9 times out of 10 were better than our final mixes because we were just doing what felt right. With a computer, you don't have to worry about pulling stuff down because every time you come to it, it's left in the same position, or you can have multiple mixes going and go to whatever you want. As you're recording all these elements, are you thinking, okay, I'm just collecting sound elements that later I'll mix? Or are you recording parts and creating sounds as you're recording and building the mix as you go? Are you recording a ton of different performances and decide later you'll sort it out in the mix? Or are you sorting it out as you go and making decisions? Thought-wise, if you think about it, if you've got 5 keyboard parts but you're not sure which one is going to be the one that's going to end up in the final mix, and then you go on to record vocals, and they're singing to something that may or may not exist in the final mix, how can they actually perform authentically to the song that they're hearing in their headphones? Sometimes the limitations force you to decide what's better, what isn't better. And you may make a decision that isn't really in retrospect the best. But you made the decision, and that's really critical because every decision you make forces the song down the path of being finalized. And the way that I like to mix is not just collect all these sound elements and then later decide what should be in the song, but more about building the foundation, and everything I add to it brings it closer to a final product. So the last overdub, it's almost completely mixed. So I'm working on making all the sonics work as I'm going. And the beauty of it is the computer can just recall everything. Back in the old days, we'd have to put red tape across the console, do not touch, because we had spent so many hours creating this. Now it's much easier to just recall everything you've done, and you can come to it in retrospect with a clear head and not being so heavily focused on what you've just done. Because typically the last overdub you do is the loudest in the mix. So you come in the next day and you go, okay, let's put it in perspective. And if you keep on building it in perspective as you create the song, you're never going to go wrong. You may not like it in the end because you might think, oh, it could have gone a different direction, but at least you've committed. And if you don't like it in the end, there's always a race, and you can always do it again. People forget that this is not brain surgery. This is music. Nobody's going to die if you do a bad mix, right? And nobody's going to die if you make a bad decision about a vocal. But people act like it's life or death half the time. I used to work with this guitar player. He was an amazing guitar player. He'd sit down and play the acoustic guitar, and I'd weep. He was so amazing. And he'd play the most amazing solo, just sitting down and I'd record it just because everything he played I wanted to record. And I'd go, "You're done. It's great." And he'd go, "That was my first solo." I'm like, "Yeah, it's great." And he'd go, "I could do better than that." And this is when I'd have to erase things. I couldn't keep everything. Nowadays, I'd just say, "Okay, do it again." And then I'd have the one I really wanted. He would force me to erase the best stuff, and then he'd spend all night trying to do it again. And a lot of musicians feel like if it isn't hard, it's not good. And that just isn't true. Some people just really are very musical, and it comes easy to them. And it doesn't have to be hard to be great. People forget that.